I am not a linguist. I am a silly teenager who makes silly YouTube videos and reads a lot of Wikipedia. Okay, now that we're past that, isn't the Latin alphabet cool? And by cool I mean everywhere. If you live anywhere that at some point in history has been dominated by Western Europeans, which is to say almost everywhere, you probably don't even think of it as the Latin alphabet. It's probably just writing to you, unless you're weird like I am, or like you're about to be because you will have watched this video. But at some point, very early on in most of our lives, like when we're in grade school, there is a period when we're like, why is there a letter X? Couldn't we just represent that with a KS? And why should we have the letter C? Aren't its sounds already covered by an S and a K? Well, prepare to have your questions answered in this video when I explain the bizarre and arbitrary history of all the letters in the English language, in order of least interesting to most interesting. Now, the ones with the simplest stories are these guys. Their evolution was relatively straightforward. See, you know how the ancient Sumerians invented writing? Well, you do now, but just because they did it first doesn't mean everyone else learned how from them. The ancient Egyptians actually came up with a completely different system of writing all on their own, and Egyptian hieroglyphs evolved into a writing system called Phoenician. Probably. Maybe. Either way, we're fairly certain that the look of the Phoenician letters was actually based off Phoenician words that started with that sound. This represented a goad, which was a thing you farmed with. This is a person's head. This is a mouth? This is supposed to be a tooth? Look, they simplified them a lot, just go with it. Now, at this point, you might be asking, what on earth does this have to do with the letters B, K, S, D, Z, L, M, N, P, T, and R? Well, while we're not sure about the link between Egyptian and Phoenician, we are quite sure that the Greeks learned how to write from the Phoenicians, the Romans learned how to write from the Greeks, and the English learned how to write from the Romans. Mostly. Kind of. Anyway, at each transition here, a lot of the letters changed a little bit, including these. This is how B changed, here's K, here's S, D, Z, L, M, N, P, T, and R. Think that was complicated? Wait till we get to some of these others. The letter X is also relatively simple. See, the Greeks had this letter for a K sound and this letter for a S sound, and when they wrote them together, for some reason they decided to just leave off the second one. So then when the Romans learned how to write from the Greeks, the Romans were like, wait, so what does this letter represent? Oh, that makes a X sound. So you guys have a letter for two sounds? Well, kind of, I guess. Oh, okay. And the Romans just rolled with it. Now let's talk about the vowels. See, the ancient Phoenicians didn't write vowels. Now, this is the part where you go, what? How did they write without vowels? What do you even mean? If the words pat, pot, pate, pet, peat, pit, and put were all spelled PT, then how would you know which one I was referring to when I was writing? Well, the answer is that the Phoenicians didn't really have many groups of words like that in their language. Even though if we tried to write like that in English, it wouldn't work out very well. Because of the way the Semitic languages work grammatically, writing in all consonants just works fine for them. The same, however, could not be said for the Greeks. The Greeks were like us, they needed vowels. Luckily, this weird thing happened. See, the Phoenician alphabet was said to have been brought to Greece by this guy named Cadmus, who was like, okay, guys, the name of each letter starts with the sound that the letter represents. For instance, this is bet, it makes a B sound. This is gummel, it makes a G sound. Okay, Cadmus, so what about this one? Oh, that? It's called ulf. Now, the sound Cadmus was referring to was called a glottal stop, a sound that you make by closing off your glottis, and that we make all the time subconsciously, and that's really hard for us to even notice. Similarly, the Greeks couldn't hear the glottal stop at the beginning of ulf, so they just assumed it made an ah sound. That happened with a bunch of other weird pharyngeal Semitic sounds, where the name of the letter was supposed to be pronounced with a consonant, but the Greeks couldn't hear the consonant, so they just made the letter represent the first vowel in the word. Or at least that's the way it worked for three of them. See, one of the weird Semitic Phoenician sounds was pronounced h, and it was completely separate from the normal h sound. So Cadmus was like, okay, this letter is het and this letter is he. The Greeks looked at each other and were like, they both sound like h, only one's weird. It sounds like he's really emphasizing the het one. Maybe he means that the one that's less breathy actually starts with a vowel? Whatever, let's go with that. So the h letter became an e letter and the h letter became a h letter. We'll get to these two later, they're more interesting. Now that we've covered the vowels, I can talk about the letter J, which evolved from the letter I. Why would a letter that makes a J sound evolve from a letter that makes an I sound? Well, the French used to have the letter I, but then they started pronouncing a lot of their I sounds as j sounds for some reason. They wanted to distinguish between these two sounds in their writing, so they made up the letter J. Okay, now I'll cover these letters. The Greeks had this one letter that made what's called a close front rounded vowel, or basically an E sound if you pursed your lips like when you pronounce oo. So I think it would be pronounced roughly like oo. The Romans heard this and thought it sounded basically like an oo sound, so they chopped off the bottom stem and made it into their letter for the oo sound. Now, the Greeks had modified their letter for the oo sound to represent the oo sound's more consonant-y cousin, the w sound, and they made it into what would become the letter F. The Romans didn't have a w sound, or at least they didn't distinguish it from their oo sound, so they used that letter for a sound they had, but the Greeks didn't, the f sound. And everything was hunky-dory until about the 1st century BC when the Romans started taking over Greece along with the rest of Europe, and they started digging up all these writings from cool Greek dudes like Plato and Aristotle and Homer, and they started transliterating a lot of Greek names and stuff into Latin, and when they did this, they decided to keep the names that had the letter Y in them as Ys, even though they didn't have this letter beforehand. Later, when the English adopted the Roman alphabet, they would use the letter Y to do the same thing the Greeks did with it, to represent the weird U sound. But why, you ask? English doesn't have an U sound. Well, it used to until we started pronouncing it like a Y or an I or an E sound instead. So, back to Rome. They had a letter for U and W, and one for F, and one for transliterating Greek words, and everything was fine, but then the Romans started pronouncing some of their words that had W sounds in them as V sounds. So they made up this variant of the U letter for this new V sound. And everything was fine again until they wanted to represent English with these letters, and the English wanted a letter to represent the W sound, unlike the Romans who were content with using the same letter for U and W. So they stuck two U's together and called it the double U, and used it to represent the W sound. So we have 5 letters in modern English that come from this one Greek letter. Now for these letters. You know how I've been talking about how the Romans learned how to write from the Greeks? Well, that's partially true. See, the Romans learned how to write from 2 people, the Greeks and these guys called Etruscans who lived just north of them. The Etruscans themselves learned how to write from the Greeks, so I mostly just ignore them, but here, when dealing with the letters C, Q, and G, they're important. The Phoenicians had these 3 letters, one for their K sound, one for their S sound, and one for their weird Semitic K sound. This was all well and good until the Greeks took all 3 of these letters even though they had no k sound, because they had assigned each letter a number and started doing math with them. Because they hadn't adopted Arabic numerals yet, and gosh darn it, they needed some symbols to do math with, and if they just dropped the weird proto-Q letter, they wouldn't have a number 90. So then when the Etruscans, who not only didn't have a k sound, but they didn't have a g sound either, learned how to write, they did the smart thing, and only took one letter to represent their one sound. Except they couldn't hear the difference between k and g, so they just took the one that looked cooler. This was fine until the Romans, who did have both a k and g sound, learned how to write from the Etruscans. They needed to distinguish between k and g, and they only had the one letter for the both of them, so they split the letter C into 2 letters, the letter C and the letter G, one to make the k sound and the other to make the g sound. They also, for really no apparent reason, took the letter Q from the Greeks and used it to make a qu sound, even though they already had a k letter and a w letter. And then the Romans started transliterating Greek stuff, and, like with the letter Y, they introduced a whole new letter to represent the old Greek names, the letter K. So now the Romans had 2 different letters for k sounds, and then when we adopted the Latin alphabet, we took both letters for our k sound. Now, that explains why we have 2 letters for the k sound, but it doesn't explain why we pronounce the letter C as a s sound sometimes. Well, that's just because of random changes in pronunciation in English that's caused us to pronounce some k sounds as s sounds. So that's why the alphabet is the way it is. It's kind of annoying how ridiculously arbitrary it is, but for the same reason, it's kind of beautiful. This writing system and these letters that surround us everywhere in life are the result of historical events that happened thousands of years ago. This is why I love linguistics. It reveals that facets of the language that surrounds me, even if they seem arbitrary and needlessly complicated, actually connect me to an ancient 3,000-year-old tradition. Once I realized that, I felt like I was constantly living in the ruins of an ancient civilization, with shadows and phantoms of people and events that existed millennia ago constantly dancing around me. Still think it's stupid and arbitrary? Well, join the club.